On to the show right after this.
Prepare to enter an immersive world of tragedies, hauntings, legends, and folklore. Southern Gothic is an independently produced podcast documenting the rich history of the American South, stretching from the swamps of Louisiana to the shores of the Carolinas, deep into the mountains of Appalachia, and across the battlefields and earliest settlements of Virginia, guiding you through some of its darkest tales and eerie locations. Join us now on Southern Gothic, the podcast.
Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strangeness of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman-Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the Unseen Paranormal. This week we welcome parapsychology researcher, author, and investigator Morgan Knudsen. Morgan has been featured on the Discovery Channel's Haunted Hospitals, Paranormal 911, and other paranormal TV shows. She is the co-founder of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings, the co-host of Supernatural Circumstances podcast, and author of Teaching the Living from Heartbreak to Happiness in a Haunted Home. You can find out more about Morgan at entityseeker.ca, and her book is available on Kindle and Amazon. Hey, Morgan, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us today.
Oh, glad to be here. Good to talk to you, and we've known each other for a while on Facebook, and it's good to hear your voice.
Yeah, it's nice to hear yours as well. I listen to your podcast.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I hear yours every once in a while. I enjoy the show. Y'all have really interesting, in-depth stories on there, and I love it.
I'm so glad. That's what we're really aiming to accomplish with it is to bring parapsychology to the forefront for people in a way that's really cool and interesting. My co-host Mike Brown and I we're both really big nerds, and we really like to be able to share that fun and enthusiasm with people about our world and the strange things that happen in it.
Yeah, and I'm kind of coming around to your way of thinking on the paranormal with what you read about in Teaching the Living, that it's a lot about intention and your thoughts and that type of stuff. So that's why I want to have you on a show to kind of deep dive more into that, because I've been doing this for like 25 years, but my views, they change. And so I like how you're kind of getting out of the boxes that people have kind of put the paranormal in and think about this in a different way that makes a lot of sense.
I really appreciate that, because I think there's a lot of basis for it. And, what people don't realize is that there's been so many people in the field over the decades and centuries, really, that have done the deep dive into the relationship between people's emotions, intentions, what we create in our world, what we manifest, and the overlay of not only hauntings, but things like psychokinesis, macropsychokinesis, and how we influence our environment. And with the influence and the deeper understanding that we're gaining now in the quantum arena, it's really changing how we look at some of this phenomenon. And we have to begin to take this into account, that we are not separate from that which is happening around us.
Yeah, and that there's not just one explanation for a haunting, that there could be lots of different factors, and it could be lots of different things, not just a presence of a detached spirit of someone.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, where the TV shows have really dug their heels in terms of, if something paranormal is happening, then it has to be a stereotype of a ghost. And that's just not true. There's this myriad of incredible phenomenon that's out there, and we don't give ourselves and our own minds enough credit for being able to manifest and materialize outside of ourselves. And so that's what with both my book and the podcast, that's what I really tried to bring that to light for people, because I think the more we can put people back in the seat of empowerment, the better our research is going to be, and the better people are going to feel about actually getting in touch with the positive side of the paranormal.
Yeah, for sure. Before we get too deep into that, let's talk about how you got into the paranormal to begin with, because you are a parapsychologist, you've been a researcher over 20 years, you've been on TV and done all these things. And then also your great-great-grandfather has an interesting story too in the paranormal.
Yeah, my great great grandfather, he was president of one of the first parapsychology associations in Canada, and he really put his career on the line as a physician. He's a very famous physician and poet and astronomer in Ontario, and he really put everything on the line to step out and say, you know what, there's something more, and I believe that this stuff exists. And he ended up writing two books on the subject, which came under a lot of heated controversy at the time because it was very unique information. It wasn't the typical, spooky haunted house type information. It was empowering. It was meant to strengthen people's relationship with non-physical energy, and it was so impactful that many people just thought, well, he's just making it up. And I'm one of the firm believers. I don't think he was making it up. I've read both. I have copies of both books, and the information is so far beyond its time. And I think that's really, it's played a role for me in terms of how I've seen what I do going forward as well. I mean, it definitely reminds you that we are all, as researchers of parapsychology, standing on the shoulders of giants, and we have a legacy to uphold.
Yeah, and we've kind of gotten away from that. Like your grandfather studied, and like Hans Holzer and some of those first people like that. We've kind of gotten away from how they study the paranormal, and like we were saying, kind of boxed ourselves into these definitions of things, and people in general like their boxes anyway, just to kind of understand the world. And a lot of people don't like to step outside of that either.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the thing with this stuff, is that it challenges people on a level that most people are not necessarily ready to be challenged on. The parapsychology challenges life paradigms, and it challenges how we see the world, and it causes us to question what it is our world consists of, how our interactions play a role in it, and it causes us to own some of the stuff we might not want to own. Some of those emotions, some of those negative thoughts, those types of things. It causes us to take a deep dive look at it, and that's something not everybody is prepared to do. Not everyone is prepared to not only look within themselves, but to realize that the universe is very much a mirror, and we're getting back so much of the energy that we're projecting and putting out there. So it really challenges people on a very deep level, and not everybody is prepared for that.
Yeah, and I think that concept a lot of people are aware of. I think they use this term in a wrong way. I even use this term in a wrong way, but a lot of us call that karma, when it's not really karma in the real definition of karma. But that's kind of what we call it, because what you put out is what you get back. And so people just, lay people, they think of it as karma instead of these other terms that like we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think too there's a bit of a misnomer about karma. And I think the idea is that people think, well, if you're a bad person or you are a good person, hence, wrapped up in the idea of action. So if you take good actions throughout your life, then you will get good actions back. And that's really not what parapsychology is talking about. What we're talking about is something deeper than that. It's where we resonate in terms of our emotional state. We get a reflection back as to what that emotional state is. If we spend the majority of our time in anger and frustration, then the universe has a way of mirroring back to us anger and frustration and more situations like it. In just in the same way that if we spend our time healing our emotional wounds and being, positive and, projecting that good energy, maybe joy, passion, whatever it is for you into the world, you end up attracting instances of that as well. And that's where it really translates with the paranormal, where sometimes those instances that are attracted back to you are the ones they come forward as paranormal or psi experiences. So the people who are, in that emotion and whatnot tend to get a taste of that reflected back at them in terms of the activity that they're experiencing. Where on the other hand, if, those same people who are doing, pretty good in the world and, living with a lot of joy and passion and things like that tend to get those experiences reflected back to them in the sense that they get to interact with loved ones maybe that have passed over or something like that. So I think karma has kind of gotten a bad rap because it's looked at as an action based thing, and it's really not.
Right, like you're saying, on a universal cosmic level, it's a spiritual thing that you're getting back, not necessarily a physical gain or a monetary gain or something like that.
Yeah, and it really doesn't, unfortunately, have to do with whether or not you've taken good actions or bad actions. I think people like to think that, if I just do really, really good, then those things are going to come back. Well, no, it really is more about how you're feeling, and the feeling is the gauge. And if you're moving through life and you're in a really negative state, then the universe will reflect that back to you. But it doesn't weigh on whether or not you're a good or bad person.
So how does that translate over into hauntings?
It's almost like a radio dial, and the way I always explain it to people is if you think about your emotional state like a radio dial, where you've got grief and depression on the one end, and way on the other end you've got passion and joy, and then there's a myriad of emotions in the middle, and where you can be sitting, say, at a place of happiness or contentment or something like that, and you begin to resonate with the things in your environment that share that same frequency, just in the same way that you would tune into a radio station and you'd hear the station that you're expecting to hear. You're expecting to hear a rock station, but you're not going to hear country music on the rock station. So the way I always explain it to people is that if you're looking for those positive experiences, those positive connections with loved ones who've passed over and things like that, you've really got to tune yourself into the frequency of where they are, which is pure positive energy. And when you're able to do that, then you have access to have all of these different experiences. But if you're tuned yourself way down into depression and grief and things like that, what's going to come through when you're putting that intention out there that you want to have these experiences, it's going to resonate with things like depression and grief and anger and frustration and things like that. And that's not where you want to be. I often get quite a lot of emails about people who have just lost somebody, and they've just had their transition experience, and they say, I really want to talk to this person right now. Something happened, and they died suddenly or something like that. And here that person is in complete and utter despair and grief, and rightly so. But it's not the time at that point to start reaching out and connecting with someone who's now in pure positive energy. You're not going to get them. You're going to get something else, and it's not going to be what you want. So it's really about doing that emotional work first, and then reaching out, then going for that connection, and the universe, it'll blow your mind.
So do you think that translates over to like poltergeist and thought forms as well?
Well, yeah, it really all comes down to a very similar phenomenon, is that it just comes down to where you're sitting at emotionally, and where you're reaching out. I think that's one of the reasons why people have such a terrible time with Ouija boards, and it's got such a bad rap, is because usually when people sit down to a Ouija board, they're thinking that they're going to be frightened. They've got already a stigmatized idea as to what the Ouija board is going to bring forward. They're evil, they're horrible. Well, then, yeah, if that's your belief and that's what you're going to be sitting with, that's ultimately probably what you're going to get out of it. But there's been a lot of channelers and people who've done very well with something like a Ouija board, who've had really wonderful experiences. At the same token, but that's not really what we're fed. So I think ultimately, yeah, I mean, when it comes to whether it be thought forms, whether it be people you've got access to in life, whether it be whatever it is, our entire universe is vibrationally based. So it's a golden rule throughout. Doesn't matter what you're doing.
Yeah, I found that interesting because, like, especially with like poltergeist is a popular phenomenon that people are pretty aware of. And it tends to center around like, teenage girls for the most part. And you got to think of the mindset that like teenage girls are in, having with hormone changes, having lots of emotions and this type stuff. And then you start having this poltergeist activity of things flying around the room and the psychokinesis that goes along with that. But yeah, I find that topic very interesting, that somebody could create this whole entity just based on their emotions and their thoughts.
Oh, yeah. And, there's some brilliant studies done years ago by Dr. William Roll and Dr. Scott Rogo. And they researched that quite heavily, where people were experiencing a myriad of activity, things, flying around the room, things moving. And it all came back to these certain individuals who were, oddly enough, on the negative end of the emotional spectrum. Now, however, what was interesting was that when they switched that up and they got these kids into a better state of mind, they still had psychokinetic responses, but they were far more beneficial to the situation than the ones when they were in negative emotion. A fellow actually coming up that we're going to be having on Supernatural Circumstances here in May, Dr. Joe Gallenberger, he works with the Monroe Institute, and he did a very deep dive study into psychokinesis and the ability to move objects deliberately. And he turned himself into a bit of a guinea pig, where he ended up working with himself enough that he could do this at will, and then began to apply it to Las Vegas. So he was actually able to turn around, show people, and he does workshops and things like that, show people how to get into the best state of mind they possibly can and use psychokinesis to their advantage in places like Las Vegas and things like that, where there is actual like notable gain one way or the other. So, it's really fascinating. And PK is, people think about it as like, oh, it's spoon bending. And, what does that have to do with my life? Well, you're creating with your mind, and it's a big deal.
Yeah, the fact that we can even do that is a crazy deal, and the fact that they've done these experiments to show that it's possible. And also, there was a famous study that you wrote about in your book where they actually created a thought form with a backstory and all that.
They did, yeah, the Philippe Experiment, and not only did they do it once, they did it twice with an entity that they created by the name of Philip, and then another one that they created by the name of Lilith. And what was so fascinating to me about that study in particular, it was a Canadian study. It was done in Ontario, and by the Toronto Society of Psychical Research and Mensa. And what was interesting was that those studies in particular, I think, are so groundbreaking and so fundamental to our understanding of hauntings and parapsychology, because they were able to create what appeared to be something that was thinking, feeling, responding, and able to interact with its environment. And that person had never, ever existed. There was never, ever a person named Philip that had that story, that had that backstory, and yet they were able to focus long and hard enough to create something that was fully interactive with the environment and then repeat the experiment twice. So, I mean, to me, there is almost no more important study out there in terms of this phenomenon than the Philippe Experiment.
Yeah, and I would tell the guests to go out and read that, or they can read about it in your book, the whole study. But it's really interesting to think that just because they sat around as a collective, they could bring a entity to life. And it was somewhat intelligent because it would answer them and things like that, but it only answered to the story that they made up about it.
Yeah, and that was really, really fascinating. And we see that repeated, that same phenomenon repeated in a lot of negative hauntings as well, which is, again, really indicative to where these negative entities might be coming from, where you'll see these things never actually create anything new. They will come back with bits and pieces of the story from, people that had maybe been living in the house before or something like that, but nothing new is ever really created by these things. So I think, we see these like bits and pieces, in current cases, but were easily repeatable in the Philippe Experiment. So there's so many really positive lessons here that I think people could take away and feel more empowered by doing so.
Yeah. Yeah, the book is great, and the fact that you named it Teaching the Living, I think, is perfect, because it really is teaching about a completely different side of the paranormal and how we have much more control over hauntings and that type stuff than we actually thought we did.
Absolutely. And that energy, this non-physical energy that we are, a part of, that we work through and with, I mean, it is the ultimate teacher. I mean, this stuff will absolutely change how you look at the world. And to me, it's really what we have to learn from it, because oftentimes, you'll get investigators and whatnot that are out there and, and they're trying to, teach other people, and, they think everybody thinks they're right and they've got a story and, whatever. But this stuff will turn your world on its end in the best possible way if you let it. And, that was kind of the goal behind the book was for people to realize that, we've got a wonderful say in our world, and we're not dependent on, those around us to change it for us. We have the ability to do this and to create what we want in terms of, in terms of our, our dreams and, sometimes our nightmares too, if we're not careful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's great. And reading the book, I've been an empath my whole life. And probably in the past, I'm almost 40, and probably in the past 10 years, I've really kind of come to terms with it, with the intuition and the feeling energy and that type stuff. So reading the book, it kind of made it all make a lot more sense. And also some of the experiences that I've had throughout my life that just kind of puzzled me. I'm like, well, that was maybe me projecting some of that stuff myself and wasn't really, because I do have a resident ghost in my house. But some of the other things that have happened, I'm like, oh, well, that could have totally been me doing it myself.
Yeah, and that's the great part about this stuff, is that I think it allows us new friendships and a new relationship with those who have passed on. And that's part of the joy about this phenomenon to begin with, is that ultimately that connection with these people doesn't have to end. And you can have these amazing interactions with things that are clearly intelligent, that, move things in the environment, that talk, that, will respond to you, that, it's really quite incredible. And I think so much of the time, we forget about that fun. Like I've lived in multiple haunted places in my lifetime. And, it's always been some of the most fascinating times of my life, that's for sure. But, those relationships are irreplaceable. They can be wonderful.
So how much, when it comes to hauntings and haunted places, because we know there's so many places in the world, that claim to be haunted and people investigate, how much do you think comes from people and their thoughts and these thought forms and stuff, and how much comes from actual spirits of people who have passed on?
Well, in my experience, a huge majority are thought form, huge majority, and more than what people would like to think. I think, I've had, as I say, some absolutely wonderful encounters with non-physical beings that are absolutely out of consciousness, or I should say consciousness, but had a body, I guess, at one point, and are wonderful. But I think we forget that we are all thought form originally anyway. So there's less of a separation there, I think, than what people think there are. But I find the majority of hauntings that are, involve negative activity, that are, aggressive, nasty, that kind of thing, you can almost hallmark it as a thought form. And you can figure it out really quickly based on the behaviors and whatnot, which is something that my colleague Stephanie and I worked on for a good 17 years. And was understanding the behaviors and of thought forms and what they do and how they seem to manifest themselves. But the majority of that is absolutely thought form. But when you get the super positive stuff, the interactions with loved ones and whatnot, you can almost guarantee that it's either somebody or it's a collective that has come around to support you. Because that's the one thing with non-physical is, no matter what you label them, the level of support that they are there to offer is undeniable when you can really get into a relationship with this stuff.
So what you're saying is they're not all demons.
No, like it's funny, that whole trope, and so many of I think things like religion and whatnot has really tried to explain it in different ways over the years as to what these things might be. Every religion's got a different name for it and whatnot. But as many of the classes that I've taught over the years, I used to teach social work psychology courses in this stuff, and it was so interesting is that we get people from all over the world, and no matter which area of the world that they came from, they all had the same stories. Everybody had a different label for it, but they all had the same stories. So it really all came back to the same thing again and again.
So how do you think this plays into something like exorcisms and supposed demonic possession and things like that?
Well, you look at things like that, and you look at the stories behind the people that have reported it over the years, and it's really not hard to see the connection. I mean, you've got, again, negative thought that is played out in a different way, but it really does come down to the same thing. And if you look back on the people and you look at their story, how this stuff comes to be, it's not really a stretch to figure it out. I mean, they're in the same type of emotional rut and turmoil often that somebody who's experiencing this external psychokinetic activity that could be really frightening and negative, and it's almost as if that stuff gets very much turned inwards. So I mean, it really is all interconnected. But interestingly enough, when you look at things like exorcism, especially the more Catholic-oriented exorcisms, the stuff that we would associate in films and things like that here in the West, oftentimes those people are very, very religious. They're very highly religious. And so again, we've got a state of expectation that's playing into that. People who have had, say, for example, these, really negative or what they claim to be negative near-death experiences, those also seem to be very culturally related and culturally driven. So, you have to kind of look at the culture, you have to look at the individual. But ultimately, it all comes back to really the same damn thing over and over again.
Yeah, and that's one of kind of the conclusions that I've come to, is that if your conviction is strong enough, then the intention is there. So it doesn't matter what you believe in. If your intention is to get rid of this thing, then it's just like you're saying, with it's all a lot of mind power and that type stuff, and how you look at it and what you think and put out there.
Oh yeah, and people miss out on the idea too that I think the universe is it's only inclusive. It's not exclusive. And so oftentimes people will come at this stuff and go, well, I want it gone and I'm going to will this thing gone, or I'm going to, get rid of this thing. Well, the universe is only inclusive. So as long as your attention is on it, it doesn't matter what form your attention has on it, whether it be, I'm going to get rid of this thing, or I want this thing. The universe doesn't hear that. It's just seeing whatever your attention's on. So it's going to include whatever you've got your attention on into the mix of what it's creating. So that, I think, runs a lot of people into trouble with this stuff, because they automatically think, well, I've tried everything. Well, if you've tried everything, you've probably got your attention on it. So it's not going to work.
Right. That's counterintuitive to trying to get rid of it. Yeah. And in the book, you kind of break down these different, because you said that you kept coming across kind of the same over and over again, and you kind of break them down into patterns of behavior and break them down into categories. Like you have the wolf, the pit bull, the familiar, and all these different categories that you saw time and time again in different hauntings.
Yeah, it was these different behaviors within the thought forms of these negative entities that were really fascinating to Steph and I, because we began to realize really early on that there were red flags. People would often say, well, this just came out of the blue. Well, actually, it doesn't. There's very subtle red flags right from the beginning of these incidences with these negative entities that can be figured out and traced backwards. And when you can catch them early on, you've got a really high potential of being able to deal with them and see them as indicators of negative emotion rather than something that you've got to fight against. So our goal was to be able to at least take a look at some of these behavior types and go, okay, here we go. We at least know the rough course and trajectory that we know this is probably going to take, what's going to set it off, and how can we get the people that are involved in the situation to deal with it different, because they are ultimately the ones that are triggering the behavior and what's going on. So when we began to break that down, we began to have a ridiculously good success rate and to be able to catch this stuff very, very, very early for people so that things didn't take a turn for the worse and get violent.
So do you think, because I know the psychological, sociological behavior definitely factors into this, do you think people that are on drugs and kind of beating themselves down with that, or have a mental health disorder, are more prone to that type of haunting?
Well, it comes back to negative emotion again, right? Like if you're in that state of being, it doesn't matter what the reason is. There you've got dysfunction and you're going to attract on that level. So, people, I had a question not that long ago, actually, where people said, well, what about, people who have trouble regulating their emotions? Well, you're going to see that played out, until that's settled and under control. You're going to continue to see that play out in your life, and not just within the paranormal, but within your life. If you're up and down all the time, then that's going to reflect back at you somewhere. So I mean, everybody is, especially when you're in the more extremes of emotions, the more likely you are to see some of this stuff happen. And again, like going back to the studies of Rolla and Rogo, they saw that repeatedly again and again also, where, the more extreme the emotion and the more pent up it is, the crazier the phenomenon tends to get, and so on and so forth. The best thing you can do with a haunted place is manage yourself, get yourself into a managed state, and you'll begin to see that reflected back.
Yeah, and I don't want the listeners to think that this is just, what you've heard from the self-help gurus for, 40 years of think positive thoughts and, positive things will come your way. It's not all of that. It is about the state of mind that you're in and how you can make your own decision about, being happy, or like you're saying, getting yourself together, because it all does come down to you. But it's not that you're not preaching that self-help stuff that's been out there for years.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's a lot to that mode of thinking, and positive psychology, for example, is a good example of that. Where the problem comes in is when you're dealing with people who are using that level of, I'm just going to be happy all the time, and they're not dealing with the stuff that they need to deal with. And that's where this can get really tricky for people, because you can turn around and have a smile on your face, and it's like putting a happy face sticker over an empty gas gauge. And if you're not really dealing with the stuff that you've got to deal with, and really find that peace of mind and that peace and state of being from the inside out, instead of just slapping a happy face sticker over it and hoping nobody notices, then those wounds, everybody has those wounds will bleed. And once you've got an infected wound, what they do is fester, and it starts to spill out everywhere. It will spill out into different places in your life. And what's interesting is I've had a number of clients, over the years who have said, okay, like I've done everything right. I've got this great life. I've got these, everything seems to be in order, but there's something that's going on within them that is not, it hasn't been worked out. It hasn't been settled. And as soon as you've got something that's there, that's bubbling, that you're trying to gloss over, that's going to come out somewhere. And oftentimes some of the first signs that people start seeing is they end up in a place and they're going, I don't understand where all this negative phenomenon is coming from. Well, it's a time to take a deep dive. And that's where this stuff for people can get very tricky, because not everybody wants to address that. Some people would rather put up with the negative stuff going on in their house than to look internally and go, man, something's not right. I got to clean this up.
Yeah, I was more talking about like the kumbaya crowd, what I'm talking about? Like, I completely understand, because when I get up every morning and I decide, you kind of decide your mood for the day. You can either, you might spill your coffee in the morning, but it's up to you if you let that ruin the rest of your day. It's up to you to make up your mind, okay, whatever that happened, and just kind of move on. That kind of kumbaya crowd, because I'm very much a realist myself. And it took me a long time to deal with some of my issues. I worked on the ambulance for many years. I had PTSD issues, and that brought forth its own kind of manifestation. But now I'm good. I've worked on that and kind of done the interflexion like you're talking about to get myself to a good place. But yeah, I was talking about the kumbaya crowd of the don't worry, be happy people that are, no matter what, it's going to be okay. Well, sometimes it's not. Like, you just have to confront that and not kind of push those emotions down and not deal with it.
Yeah, it's all in how you're dealing with them. What's really interesting is in the book, I talk about the Power 9, which is something that has to do with blue zones. And blue zones were designated by National Geographic to be some of the happiest places in the world. And what was really fascinating about the Power 9 is that all of the 9 factors that really make up what it is for a place or a person to be really, really genuinely happy, have to do with having the support system. It has to do with the time to decompress, taking the time for yourself to be able to deal with some of that negativity, to be able to deal with some of that stuff that's just not, not the pleasant stuff. But taking the time to actually decompress that, having the support system, be able to have a community around you that is going to support and enlighten that load. So, all of that really played a big factor into some of the happiest places or considered in the world. And interestingly, almost none of them were wealthy. It all had to do with exactly what we're talking about, which is being able to be in an environment that's conducive to self-care.
And so with kind of the state of the world nowadays, do you think that this is increasing the number of hauntings, or because mental health has kind of come more to the forefront here, especially in the past few years, about how much more important it is? And that's why I find it fascinating, because mental health even comes into the paranormal now, and starting to understand that. But do you think it's increasing because you have people with more anxiety and these type things, or do you think that people are actually dealing with their mental health issues more, and so it's decreasing?
Well, I think there's definitely been a massive increase in mental health problems since the lockdowns. That's been noted by multiple studies now over the years, and we're really coming into a crisis time period of mental health problems, especially in younger people. So I have a funny feeling like we're going to see an increase in some strange stuff going on, but also we'll probably see that increase, or there's been a history of increase, for example, within time periods of pandemics and things like that over the years, because people not only are home more, but they're becoming more aware and oftentimes attributing things that aren't paranormal to things that might be, and vice versa. So I think we're about to see not necessarily I don't know whether I'd say increase, but I think we will definitely see a shift in what we're seeing. And the types of things we're probably going to be called for as investigators and things like that. I think for researchers going forward into the next number of years, I think having a team of people around that are mental health professionals, being able to reach out to psychologists and things like that, and having an active dialogue with people, I think is going to be really important, because I think what we're going to be called for and what we're going to see is going to be it's going to shift.
Yeah, and that makes sense, because also the like you were saying, the number of hauntings and people reporting hauntings during the pandemic kind of went through the roof, because people are home more, so that maybe they're noticing more, but also they're more stressed. So this, they're inducing their own type of haunting in a way too, because of all this stress and anxiety and things going on with the pandemic. I've heard for probably quite a few years now, a lot of paranormal investigators and mediums and people saying that the thinning of the veil, in a way, which I don't know if that's really a thing, but it would make sense with mental health issues going up, like you're saying, that we're seeing a lot more paranormal activity.
Well, I mean, I don't know about I don't know about the whole thinning of the veil concept, because I think that non-physical is accessible to us regardless. I don't think it's really changed. I think if anything's shifting, it's our awareness that's shifting, and being just more open about it within cultures of people coming forward more, and that's the one thing that the media has really done is made this a household discussion. But I think we're going to see a prevalence in people being a little bit more aware of that connection with non-physical, especially because there's been people that have dealt with possibly more death over the last couple of years. They've been dealing with a lot of, like you were saying, a lot of stressors and whatnot. And I think people have reached a point where they're really starting to look for empowerment. They're starting to take a hard look at, well, wait a minute, like, I don't want to feel disempowered anymore. I felt disempowered for the last 2 years, and now what? So what I've noticed when the lockdowns first started, I started doing an online group called Spiritual Healthcare, and we were meeting every day for a while, and then we started to meet once a week and whatnot. But that I realized during that most of the tools that we work with and practice with as researchers really do just translate to people who are feeling disempowered or frightened, whether it be because there's something in their environment they can't control, or whether it be, a situation like what we've just dealt with or whatever. And so I think a lot of people are just reaching out now for new things, for new empowerment and more positivity, because we've been dealt this blow of such negativity and constant pressure from the media to, you have to be afraid, you have to be vigilant, there's no positivity there for 2.5 years. So I think people are really reaching for that as well.
Yeah. So you got, there's another season of Haunted Hospitals coming up. I know has been filming here lately. What else do you have going on coming up?
Oh gosh, so this coming summer, I will have a brand new book out called The Gift of Instinct. And that one is going to be a really fun book, because it's all about us standing on the shoulders of the giants of parapsychology and understanding the role of our instinct throughout all of this, and that we all have the ability to turn our lives around with, this extraordinary world that we live in. So that'll be out in the summer. I've got a number of live shows that'll be coming up over the next number of months, which will always be listed on entityseeker.ca. And Supernatural Circumstances, of course, has been a pretty big hit, and people can download that on no matter what podcast platform you're using. You'll find it. We're basically everywhere. We're like our own little plague. And so those are the two the biggies anyway. And then the season 4 of Haunted Hospitals will be out later this year.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. I love this in-depth stuff, and the fact that, trying to change the way that we think about the paranormal, that there's a whole lot more to it than just little boxes we put everything in.
Oh, it's so much fun, and it's supposed to be.
Yeah. And trying to answer some of these questions that we all have. And for me, this way of thinking kind of answers a lot more questions, but it also opens 1,000 more questions too.
It always does.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Morgan.
Oh, thank you, Eric.
All right, everybody, stay safe out there. You have a good day. We'll see you next time. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. The Unseen Paranormal Podcast is proud to be the ambassador for paranormal for Verbal.com. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening.
You have come to the end of the line. Whoa. I can feel you as you pass the other side.